There are names in the Imperium that echo like wounds carved into the fabric of history, names whispered in litanies and battle cries, names that refuse to die even after the flesh that bore them has long since turned to dust. Yet among them all, one name stands as both salvation and sorrow, as triumph balanced forever on the knife edge of tragedy. Sanguinius, the angel, the one Primarch whose radiance shone so fiercely that even the darkest corners of humanity dared to hope. To speak of him is to trace the outline of a figure whose very existence felt like a blessing humanity was never meant to keep, as though the galaxy itself conspired to dim a light too bright for its age of iron and blood. His legend persists not merely because he died, but because of how he lived, a being sculpted with impossible grace, burdened with visions of futures so bleak that lesser souls would have collapsed beneath their weight. He walked with the certainty of doom upon his shoulders and still chose compassion, even as the great engines of the Imperium devoured worlds in the name of unity. Where others ruled through fear or relentless logic, he ruled through inspiration, through the sense that standing beside him made even the broken feel whole. And yet, for all his strength, for all the divine presence that seemed to radiate from every beat of his wings, he carried a sorrow deeper than the void itself, a sorrow mirrored in the endless nightmares of the sons he led into battle. To explore his life is to plunge into a story woven from contradictions, a creature of beauty forged in a universe that despises beauty, a being of mercy shaped for war, a prophet doomed to watch the vision of his own death again and again, as though fate wished to punish him for the mere crime of existing. His legend is steeped in glory, but the truth of his existence is something far more haunting. It is to witness the quiet sacrifices behind the myth, the intimate brutality of duty, the torment of foresight, and the unbearable weight of hope in an age where hope is a liability. This is not merely the tale of a Primarch. It is the unraveling of a soul caught between destiny and despair, between the Emperor's dream and the galaxy's inevitable decay. This is the horrifying life of Sanguinius, told not as a myth, but as the lived experience of an angel born into a universe that envies wings. The winds of Baal Secundus had a way of scouring the soul long before they stripped the flesh, and in the earliest memories preserved by the wandering tribes of that poisoned world, they spoke of a day when the storms parted just long enough for something impossible to fall from the heavens, an infant whose very presence seemed to defy the brutal logic of their existence. They found him half buried in the irradiated dust, his wings trembling like pale flames as he struggled to breathe in the toxic air, yet even then he did not cry. Instead, he looked upon the ragged survivors who gathered around him with eyes so clear that the elders swore. Later it felt as though he were seeing through time itself. Life on Baal Secundus was measured in hunger and loss, in nights spent listening to the howls of predators mutated beyond reason, and in days wandering the cracked salt flats where entire caravans vanished without leaving a single track behind. For a child to survive in such a place was miracle enough, but a child who grew with the radiance of a star and the grace of a creature who seemed carved from myth was something that reshaped the very rhythm of the tribes that adopted him. The boy who would become Sanguinius learned to walk on ground that could melt bone, learned to read the shifting patterns of the wasteland storms as though they were scripture, and learned to comfort those who feared the deformities that clung to them like curses, speaking softly to the ones who had forgotten their own names in the aftermath of Rad Fever. Even then, he towered with a nobility that felt entirely at odds with the world that shaped him. For Baal Secundus was not merely dangerous, it was indifferent, a place where mercy was a weakness and compassion, a luxury no one could afford. Yet Sanguinius offered both freely, moving among the wounded with hands that healed more than bodies, as if the simple act of being near him restored something of the humanity the tribes had lost across generations of hardship. They called him Angel long before they understood what a Primarch truly was, long before the sky tore open in the final days of their isolation and revealed the Emperor's golden legions descending like judgment writ in metal. But in those early years, the Angel was simply a boy who carried hope as naturally as he carried breath, guiding hunters through the dunes with an instinct that seemed uncanny, standing alone between mutated beasts and the children they stalked, and offering visions he could not explain, glimpses of futures that flickered through his mind like reflections on broken glass. Some nights he would stand atop the rusted carcass of an ancient manufactorum ruin, staring into the horizon as if listening for a voice only he could hear, his wings unfurling against the light of Baal Secundus's dying sun. The elders watched him grow with both fear and reverence, for they sensed in him a destiny that did not belong to their world, a destiny big enough to drown entire star systems. But it was not destiny that defined him in those years. It was the quiet sorrow that crossed his face whenever he touched someone dying, as though he felt not only their pain, but the echo of every death he would one day witness across the Imperium. Those who lived beside him spoke of the nights when he woke with his wings trembling, the visions of blood and fire burning behind his eyes long before he had words to describe them. It was as if Baal Secundus had offered him a mirror to the future, and in that mirror he saw a galaxy screaming beneath the weight of betrayal, a throne shrouded in grief, and a brother with a spear of treachery buried deep in the heart of mankind's dream. But even as the visions tore at him, he bore them with a quiet resilience that made the tribes believe he was not merely a gift, but a final mercy in a world that had forgotten what mercy looked like. And so his childhood became a tapestry woven from contrasts, beauty against decay, gentleness against brutality, hope against inevitability. Every step he took across the poisoned sands seemed to redeem something of the planet itself, as though his presence reminded Baal Secundus of the life it once nurtured before the rad storms consumed it. Yet for all his compassion, he trained relentlessly, sparring with the tribe's strongest warriors using weapons fashioned from scrap metal and bone, his movements so fluid that even seasoned fighters found themselves disarmed before they understood how he had closed the distance. But Sanguinius never fought to dominate. He fought to protect, to learn, to shape himself into something that could shield the people who had become his family from a universe that showed no kindness. And in the end, when the sky opened and the Emperor descended, it was this duality, this fusion of tenderness and unyielding strength, that defined the moment father and son met for the first time. The tribes fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the brilliance of the custodian guard, the thunder of landing craft, the unmistakable aura of the master of mankind. Yet Sanguinius did not kneel. He stepped forward through the dust and radiation haze, wings unfurled, eyes steady, as if he had been waiting for this encounter since the moment of his birth. Witnesses swore the air shimmered between them, as though two celestial forces had finally aligned after lifetimes apart. But beneath the awe, beneath the radiant reunion, there lingered a quiet truth known only to the Angel, that the path before him was soaked in blood, and that the future he had foreseen since childhood would not spare him simply because he longed for peace. And so the boy of Baal Secundus, shaped by desolation yet unbroken by it, took his first step toward the destiny that would one day carve his legend across the stars and seal his doom. From the moment Sanguinius learned to name the shapes that drifted through his dreams, he understood that the visions haunting him were not the fleeting specters of a troubled mind, but windows into futures already unfolding somewhere in the labyrinth of possibility. And this burden of foresight settled upon him long before he could articulate the terror woven into each revelation. Even as a child on Baal Secundus, he would freeze mid-step, eyes clouding over with the reflection of a distant battlefield, the screams of warriors echoing faintly in his ears, while his tribe waited in uneasy silence for him to return to himself. And when he did, he always wore the same expression, a fragile calm stretched over the tremors of a soul that had seen too much. With every passing year, the visions deepened, sharpening from abstract impressions into violent detail, until he could feel the heat of promethium fire licking at his feathers, taste the metallic sting of blood in the air, and hear the fractured whisper of a brother's voice calling his name across the abyss of betrayal. The tribe could not understand the source of these episodes, but they recognized the fear that followed them, for in those moments when the angel clutched the earth and gasped for breath as if drowning in the future, they saw a being who carried a weight no mortal should bear. And though he did not speak of the specifics, he could not hide the sorrow when he looked upon those he cared for, knowing how many he would one day fail to save. When the emperor reclaimed him, that sorrow did not fade. It only grew more defined as the warp itself began to open wider to his perception, revealing fragments of destiny in jagged flashes that carved themselves into his consciousness with increasing violence. During the early years of the Great Crusade, the Ninth Legion welcomed their Primarch with a fervor unmatched by any other legion's reunion, for they sensed in him a spirit that resonated with their own fractured histories. Yet even among his sons, Sanguinius found no respite from the visions that haunted him. The more he led them into battle, the more clearly he saw the shadow hovering over their future, a darkness coiling in their blood like a serpent waiting for its chance to strike. He felt the red thirst gnawing at the edges of their sanity, an echo of some ancient flaw intertwined with their gene seed. And though he fought every day to shield them from its pull, he knew deep within that he could not stop its progression, only delay it. But the visions he suffered were not limited to his legion's decline. They reached far beyond, tracing the fracturing alliances between the Primarchs, the growing hubris in the imperial court, and a storm gathering around a brother whose name he could barely bring himself to whisper even in private prayer. Sometimes, during quiet moments aboard the Red Tier, he would stand before the stasis-locked relics of Baal, letting their presence steady him while he forced himself to sift through the latest premonitions. Each one was a splinter driven beneath the skin of his spirit, worlds burning under the sigils of rebellion, fleets torn apart by treachery, and a throne engulfed in a darkness so profound it seemed to devour light itself. But the most agonizing vision was the one that returned again and again, the sight of a vast red fortress, a shattered gate, and himself standing alone against a warlord whose very existence radiated corruption. He saw the moment of impact, the swing of a monstrous claw, the taste of his own blood filling his mouth, and the realization that everything he was, angel, warrior, brother, would end in that single instant. And still, each time the vision struck, he forced himself to rise, because despair was a luxury the Imperium could not afford. His sons sensed the strain, though he concealed it beneath a veneer of serenity so perfect it might have seemed divine had they not known him so intimately. They watched him walk the halls of their flagship with a gentle smile that belied the exhaustion in his eyes, listened to his encouragements on the eve of battle, and witnessed the tenderness with which he spoke to the wounded, as though speaking to fragments of his own heart. But they also saw the moments when he retreated into silence, the subtle tightening of his wings when he believed no one was looking, and the flicker of anguish that crossed his face when the black rage claimed yet another of their number. For Sanguinius felt every loss as a wound carved into his spirit, not because he was weak, but because his love for his legion was so profound that their suffering became indistinguishable from his own. In the rare moments he allowed himself to confess even a sliver of his burden, he did so not through words, but through presence. Kneeling beside a brother consumed by visions of the Primarch's own death moment, He would wrap his arms around the thrashing warrior and whisper assurances that resonated not with command, but with grief. And though his sons believed him a beacon of hope, Sanguinius knew that hope itself could become a blade turned inward when one could see how fragile it truly was. The emperor never spoke openly of the nature of Sanguinius's foresight, but the angels sensed that his father understood more than he let on. During the quiet hours between campaigns, when the legions gathered around the master of mankind for counsel, Sanguinius would sometimes catch the emperor watching him with an expression that straddled pride and sorrow, as though he too saw the threads of destiny tightening around his most luminous son. There were rumors whispered among the custodian guard, rumors that the angel's soul burned so brightly in the warp that even demons recoiled from its radiance, but that this same luminosity made him a beacon vulnerable to visions not meant for mortal minds. Sanguinius dismissed such speculation, not out of arrogance but humility. He knew his strength was a gift, and like all gifts in the Imperium, it came with a cost he was destined to pay. But he could not help wondering, during those rare and fleeting conversations with his father, whether the emperor had foreseen his final hours as clearly as he himself had. Once, in the aftermath of a devastating campaign that left entire sectors smoldering, the emperor placed a hand on Sanguinius's shoulder, a gesture rare enough to carry the weight of unspoken truths. In that brief contact, Sanguinius felt a flood of emotion that struck him harder than any vision: love, regret, and a duty so immense it eclipsed even the angel's comprehension. The emperor said nothing, and yet Sanguinius understood. The future he saw was not a trap to escape, but a path he was expected to walk. As the Great Crusade pressed onward, the visions only grew more relentless. Sometimes they struck him in the midst of battle, forcing him to fight blind for precious seconds as images of Terra ablaze or brothers locked in mortal combat overwhelmed his senses. Other times they arrived in the dead of night, rousing him from meditation with the sound of phantom wings beating against a storm of blood. At their worst, they left him trembling, wings wrapped tightly around himself like a shield, the echoes of a future scream still vibrating in his bones. Yet despite the agony, he refused to yield to fear, for he believed that every glimpse of tragedy allowed him to alter the course of fate, even if only slightly. He became more protective of his legion, more vigilant in his interactions with fellow Primarchs, and more attuned to the subtle changes in the warp that hinted at an approaching catastrophe. His foresight, once a burden he struggled to comprehend, became a compass pointing toward disaster, one he followed not out of resignation, but out of determination to soften the blow where he could. And still, in the quiet chambers of his flagship, or in the aftermath of a battlefield drenched in the blood of friend and foe alike, Sanguinius grappled with an inescapable truth, that no matter how fiercely he fought, no matter how deeply he loved, he could not prevent the moment he had seen since childhood. The vision of that final confrontation clung to him like a shadow, shaping his choices, guiding his actions, and carving into him a resolve as unyielding as the planets he once sheltered. He understood that prophecy was not granted to spare him, but to prepare him. And so he bore his visions with a dignity that defied the nightmares clawing at his mind, knowing that his duty demanded not that he escape his fate, but that he meet it with wings unfurled, so that those he loved might live a little longer in the light he left behind. War has a taste, and Sanguinius learned its bitterness long before he faced the great betrayals that would one day break the Imperium. For even during the brightest years of the Great Crusade, he could feel the echo of violence resonating through every campaign, a reminder that each victory carved another wound into the soul of humanity. His first major command after reuniting with the Ninth Legion took him across the shattered fringes of the Ghoul stars, where entire systems whispered of horrors lurking in the void, and despite the triumphs celebrated in Imperial records, Sanguinius never forgot the smell of scorched metal and ionized blood that clung to the corridors of the vessels he boarded, nor the sight of skeletal remains fused into the bulkheads of drifting hulks claimed by unknown forces. In each world reclaimed, he sensed layers of suffering buried beneath the rubble, a quiet history of fear and defiance that resonated with the memories of Bal Secundus. Yet unlike his homeworld, these planets had once known peace, and their ruin carried a different kind of sorrow, one that tightened around his heart every time his wings brushed the ashes of a burned-out civilization. And so, even as the angel led his sons to countless victories, he did so with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the ferocity of the Imperium's expansion. He carried wounded civilians in his own arms, blessed the dying with whispered promises that soothed their terror, and ensured that every liberated city felt the presence of a protector rather than a conqueror. His legion reflected this compassion, learning from him not only the art of war, but the art of mercy, and in time the Blood Angels became known not only for their prowess, but for the strange, luminous hope they brought to those they saved. But hope was fragile, and war had a way of crushing fragile things beneath its heel. The deeper the Great Crusade pushed into the void, the more frequently Sanguinius found himself standing on the threshold between triumph and tragedy. For with each conflict he sensed a shift in the balance of the galaxy, subtle at first, like the faint quiver of a hunter's breath before releasing an arrow, and then stronger, as though some vast and malignant will watched humanity's expansion with growing hostility. On the blackened plains of Melchior, he fought against insurgents driven to madness by whispers no mortal mind should endure, and even after securing victory, he felt an oppressive weight pressing against his thoughts, as if the warp itself recoiled from his presence. In the ruins of Kael'thas IV, he discovered temples carved with symbols that clawed at his vision, triggering a rush of blood-scented premonitions that left him gasping against the shattered remains of an ancient altar. And on the derelict citadels of the Hallow Stars, he glimpsed shadows moving against the void, monstrous silhouettes that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them, leaving only a lingering dread that settled in the pit of his stomach. His sons noticed the change, though they did not understand it. They saw their Primarch pause for a heartbeat longer before entering an enemy stronghold, saw the flicker of sadness in his eyes when he gazed at a world ravaged by forces far older than the Imperium, and heard the tremor in his voice when he urged them to be vigilant, not against Xenos or heretics, but against despair itself. As the campaigns pressed onward, the Ninth Legion found itself embroiled in conflicts that tested not only their strength but their spirit. On the world of Kithaeron, a planet shrouded in perpetual gloom, Sanguinius led his warriors through a sprawling labyrinth of catacombs, battling creatures that flickered in and out of existence like half-formed nightmares, their bodies dissolving into smoke when struck, their voices echoing with a maddening cadence that clawed at the mind. The deeper they ventured, the more the angel felt the warp twisting around them, pulling at the edges of his foresight, as if trying to drag him into a future drowned in shadow. He pressed on regardless, burning with a resolve that radiated through his legion, guiding them through the darkness until they reached the heart of the labyrinth, a colossal chamber filled with corpses arranged in patterns that defied logic. In that moment, the vision struck him with a force that drove him to one knee, a flash of gold and crimson, a broken throne, and a scream that reverberated across eternity. His sons rushed to his side, but he forced himself upright, masking the trembling of his wings as he ordered them to destroy the chamber and purge the corruption within. They obeyed, though none failed to notice the way he lingered at the threshold, staring into the darkness as if expecting it to speak back to him. Not all his trials were fought in silence. There were times when the Great Crusade brought him into conflict with forces so overwhelming that even his presence could not soften the brutality of war. On the world of Gathara, an empire ruled by a tyrant whose armies numbered in the billions, Sanguinius led a spearhead assault that broke the defensive line like a blade cutting through cloth. He struck with such speed that the enemy believed they faced an entire legion, not realizing that it was the angel alone carving a path through their ranks, wings beating against the thick smoke as he lifted artillery tanks overhead and hurled them into fortifications with the strength of a god. His sons followed in awe, inspired by his courage, driven by the certainty that as long as he led them, victory was inevitable. But Sanguinius knew the truth. He fought with such fury not to inspire fear, but to end the conflict swiftly and spare as many lives as he could. When the tyrant fell, crushed beneath the ruins of his palace during a final stand, Sanguinius did not celebrate. He stood in the courtyard where thousands had died, letting their grief wash over him until the stars dimmed behind his tears. In those moments, his sons understood the cost of compassion. They understood why their Primarch spent long hours alone after each battle, wings folded tightly around himself as though trying to contain the sorrow that threatened to spill into the warp. Despite the endless victories, whispers began to spread among Imperial commanders. Whispers that Sanguinius was too gentle, too merciful, too unwilling to embrace the harsher doctrines of war. Some suggested that he lacked the ruthless cunning of Guilliman, the relentless fury of Russ, or the cold precision of Dorn. But those who had fought beside him understood that his strength did not lie in brutality. It lay in the ability to see the humanity buried beneath layers of fear and hatred. And yet, even they did not fully grasp the magnitude of the burden he carried, for Sanguinius fought not only enemies of flesh and bone, but the creeping corruption he sensed growing within the Imperium itself. He saw cracks forming in the foundations of the brotherhood between Primarchs, sensed the pride swelling in some, the resentment brewing in others, and the distant tug of dark promises that slithered through the warp like venomous serpents seeking purchase in vulnerable hearts. In the quiet corners of the fleet, away from the songs of victory and the fervor of Imperial propaganda, Sanguinius felt a storm building, one that no amount of strength or compassion could keep at bay. He spoke rarely of these fears, confiding only in a select few of his most trusted sons, though even then he chose his words with care, framing his concerns not as prophecy, but as intuition. To Captain Ralderon, he once described the feeling as standing on the edge of a precipice during a calm night, knowing the ground would crumble the moment the wind shifted. To Azkaelon, he confessed that some shadows seemed to stretch longer with each passing year, as if the light of the Great Crusade dimmed even at the height of its triumph. But he never revealed the full truth. The visions of betrayal that haunted him, the image of a brother kneeling in darkness, the whisper of a name that tasted like ash on his tongue. For Sanguinius knew that fear was contagious, and his sons depended on his strength to face the horrors of the galaxy. To burden them with knowledge of what he had seen would risk breaking the very spirit he sought to protect. Yet no matter how deeply he buried his fears, the universe continued to remind him that war was not a storm one could outrun. On the world of Palisade, a fortress moon riddled with trenches and plasma-scarred plains, he led one of the most harrowing sieges of the Crusade, battling an enemy so entrenched that the campaign stretched into months of relentless attrition. Every day the skies burned with artillery fire. Every night the wounded cried out beneath the dim glow of Medicae lamps, and Sanguinius stood at the center of it all, wings soaked in blood, voice hoarse from urging his sons onward. He fought with a ferocity unmatched even among the Primarchs, not because he sought glory, but because he felt the weight of every dying breath around him. When victory finally came, it tasted hollow, for the price had been too steep, and the angel knew that even if they held the fortress, they could not reclaim the lives lost to secure it. Through it all, a single truth crystallized in his heart. The galaxy was changing, reshaping itself around an approaching catastrophe. And though he did everything in his power to guide his sons, to shield the helpless, and to soften the blade of war, he could not silence the whisper growing stronger in his mind, a whisper that told him the greatest battle of his life had not yet begun, and when it came, he would face it alone. In the drifting half-light between memory and myth, I found myself drawn deeper into the recollections Sanguinius carried like invisible wounds, echoes of a dream he could never escape, and yet could never fully explain. For the truth behind the Emperor's purpose was a tapestry woven in secrecy, need, and sacrifice, and even the Primarchs, mighty beyond mortal comprehension, were often left clutching only fragments of intent, glimpses of meaning glimpsed through veils they could not pierce. And as he walked with me through visions that were not entirely visions, he spoke in a voice that trembled with restrained awe and unshed sorrow, telling me how, in the earliest days of his life, he would awaken in the golden haze of Baal's nights, certain he had heard something calling him from a distance so infinite, it felt like a horizon behind the stars, a presence he could neither name nor refuse, a whisper in a tongue older than the Imperium yet familiar in the marrow of his bones, and he wondered, though only as a private thought, never spoken aloud, if such murmurs were merely the echo of his own desperation to belong to a universe that had cast him adrift, or something deeper still, some intangible bond linking him to the being who would one day call him son. Though he never framed this as truth, only as the restless speculation of a child trying to understand the weight he felt, even before he understood what burdens were, and as he grew, those murmurs sharpened into flashes of images he could not interpret, a throne of blinding radiance, a galaxy aflame in potential, a golden figure standing alone amidst infinite night, and a sensation of falling that did not feel like fear, but purpose, as though his very existence was a descent toward a destiny he had not chosen but could not deny. And when at last the Emperor found him and their gazes met in that silent, earth-shaking moment, Sanguinius confessed that he felt something inside him settle, not with certainty, but with resignation, as if an answer he had subconsciously feared finally stepped into the light, though he would later come to understand that answers in the Imperium were rarely solutions, merely new forms of burden. And as the years unfolded into the age of Imperium, he carried his foreknowledge, his visions, his glimpses of doom, not as a gift, but as a quiet curse, one he bore in silence to spare his brothers and sons the crushing weight of inevitability. For he knew that prophecy was a chain no warrior could fight against, and though he spoke softly of hope, his nights were filled with dreams of murder. Drenched halls, the roar of a demon king, and the looming silhouette of betrayal's shadow stretching across the stars, yet he pressed onward, determined not to let bloodshed define his fate, even as he sensed its approach, telling me that a leader's duty was not merely to fight battles, but to give others a reason to believe survival had meaning beyond breathing. And so he stood, again and again, as a beacon of nobility in a galaxy where light itself seemed an endangered relic, though even beacons feel the strain of their own glow, and at times, he admitted this with a rare tremor in his voice, he wondered whether the Emperor ever intended for him to withstand such torment, or whether he was simply the only one of the Primarchs capable of doing so without breaking, not out of strength, but out of compassion. For compassion makes martyrs of those unwilling to abandon others, and Sanguinius was perhaps the most compassionate being humanity ever claimed as its champion, though he dismissed such praise as sentimentality unbefitting a son of the Imperium, insisting instead that he simply did what was required of him, even when doing so demanded the abandonment of his own peace. And as he told me of these impressions, always careful to frame them as memories shaped by emotion rather than empirical truth. He recounted one dream in particular that haunted him long before Horus fell to corruption, a dream in which he stood at the foot of a shattered throne, the air thick with smoke and the cold taste of ashes clinging to his tongue. And in the distance, he heard the faint pulse of a dying heartbeat that felt both familiar and impossibly distant. And though he never said the emperor's name, the implication hung between us like a suspended blade, shimmering with unspoken dread. Yet even as he carried such grim forewarnings, he found solace in his sons, the blood angels whose devotion to him carved a strange kind of sanctuary amidst endless war. And he cherished the rare moments when he could simply observe them training, their armor gleaming beneath the Arx Angelicum's light, as if untouched by the bloodshed awaiting them beyond the stars. And for a heartbeat he could pretend that destiny was not carved into the marrow of their line, that the red thirst and the black rage were not curses that shadowed every triumph, though he always knew such hope was fleeting. For hope in the Imperium must often survive as a whisper rather than a proclamation. Yet he guarded that whisper fiercely, holding it close even when battlefields burned beneath him and his wings. Those ethereal, luminous wings that made mortals mistake him for an angel were coated in the soot and ichor of slain foes, and as he spoke of these memories, his expression wavered between longing and anguish, revealing that even legends yearn for reprieve. And in that fragile moment I asked him a question that I almost regretted the instant it formed on my tongue, whether he ever truly believed the emperor understood the depth of the suffering he carried. And Sanguinius paused, his gaze drifting toward a horizon only he could see, before answering with a quiet uncertainty that struck deeper than any declaration, saying that perhaps understanding was never the point, that perhaps the emperor did not need to know the fullness of his son's suffering, so long as they continued the work he entrusted to them. And though he did not voice it aloud, I sensed that he hoped, desperately, that somewhere in the unreachable labyrinth of the Golden Throne, the emperor might have felt even a fraction of the love he bore for him. Yet Sanguinius left that hope undefined, allowing it to remain a flicker rather than a doctrine. And as his memories faded back into the drifting haze from which they came, I felt the tremor of something vast and unresolved stirring in their wake, as if destiny itself had drawn breath. He told me that the last thing he remembered before the final descent into the madness of that accursed vessel was not the roar of war engines or the thunder of the traitors pounding at the eternity gate, but the silence, the impossible, fragile silence that settles just before a soul accepts what the universe has already decided for it. And in that quiet, he confessed he felt neither fear nor defiance, only an aching tenderness for all that would be lost, as if he carried within him a final catalogue of every life he had ever touched, every warrior who had ever raised their blade for him, every whisper of devotion spoken by the blood angels who believed him to be more than a weapon forged in the emperor's distant design. And as he stepped into the corrupted heart of the War Master's flagship, he felt a strange clarity, an understanding that this moment was the culmination of every vision that had hunted his dreams since childhood, though knowing did not spare him sorrow, for prophecy may brace the mind, but it does not soften the weight of inevitability pressing down on the heart. And as he advanced through the corpse-lit corridors where warp-born shadows clung to the walls like the ghostly residue of damned prayers, he felt the psychic pressure of chaos creep along the edges of his consciousness, whispering its hollow promises, its mockeries of destiny, but he ignored them, drawing strength not from pride or fury, but from the simple truth that someone had to stand in that place, someone had to face the War Master's damnation so that the Imperium might have even a fragment of tomorrow. And though he never said it explicitly, I sensed that a part of him hoped, in some unreachable corner of his spirit, that Horus, his brother once beloved, might for an instant remember the man he used to be before the warp hollowed him out. Yet even that hope flickered like a dying ember, fragile and naive, and so he pushed it aside, knowing sentiment had no place in the crucible he was entering, and as he approached the final chamber, the air thickened with the metallic tang of blood and ozone, and the deck beneath his boots trembled with the distant convulsions of a ship half alive and half possessed, the pulsing of its corrupted heart echoing like a monstrous heartbeat that sought to drown out his own, and still he walked, wings dimmed beneath the sickly light but unbowed. For courage does not need brilliance. It survives even in dimness. And when at last he entered the throne-room-turned-abattoir where Horus waited, he felt the universe tighten around them, as if time itself held its breath. And though he recounted no details with certainty, never claiming absolute truth, only the way memory and emotion preserved the moment, he described Horus as something both familiar and grotesquely alien, a twisted reflection of the noble warlord he once admired, and in that confrontation, Sanguinius understood a terrible truth, that love and hatred could coexist within a single heartbeat, that grief could sharpen resolve, that loyalty did not require blindness, and though he knew he could not defeat Horus, he refused to retreat. For some acts are necessary not because they promise victory, but because their absence would stain the soul forever, and so he fought with every fragment of strength left in him, wings beating against the warp-tainted air, blade flashing with the fury of a lifetime spent protecting humanity from the monstrosities that sought to devour it. And though the outcome was written in the stars long before that duel began, he did not yield easily, carving his defiance into the very hull of the vessel with each strike, each step, each breath, until the final blow came crashing down upon him like the collapse of a star, and he felt his body give way beneath it, bones fracturing, vision shattering into shards of light and darkness. Yet in that moment of annihilation, he reached out, not with his hands but with the last remnants of his consciousness, toward the memory of all he cherished, and he held on to it, refusing to let his death be defined solely by defeat, and whether by fate or mere perception. He saw a flicker of hesitation in Horus's eyes, a crack, an echo of the brother he had loved, though he would never claim this as fact, only as the final grace his mind offered him in the instant before oblivion claimed him, and as he fell, he felt no fear, only a profound quiet. The same quiet that had preceded his birth, the same quiet that seemed to cradle him as he drifted into the void, a quiet not of emptiness but of release. And though he did not speak of an afterlife or ascension, he admitted feeling something like warmth, not divine, not promised, simply familiar. Like the final echo of the Emperor's distant presence, a presence he had chased through visions and doubts his entire life, and whether it was real or a dying mind's farewell gift, he accepted it, letting it carry him into the dark. And when his story ended, when his memories faded back into silence, I found myself haunted not by the tragedy of his death, but by the tenderness with which he embraced it, understanding at last that Sanguinius' greatness had never been in his wings, or his strength, or even his prophetic visions, but in his capacity for love in a universe that sought to crush it. And I wondered, as I stood alone in the drifting quiet he left behind, whether the Imperium remembered him as he truly was, or only as the angelic martyr carved into its monuments. And though I could not know, I felt certain that somewhere, in the unreachable golden labyrinth of the throne, a father remembered too, not with tears, not with regret, but with the silent acknowledgement of a bond that even death could not sever. And in that thought, faint though it was, I found a sliver of solace. For if legends must fall, let their shadows at least remember the light that made them worth mourning.